how did you arrive at your stance that you took at the inquiry?
Okay, well, look, I suppose to be totally scrupulously honest about it, in the period that I was Premier, if this was put to me, I probably wouldn't have been supportive of a change or making a change in the legislation. But I didn't know some of the facts that have then been brought to my attention subsequently. And the facts actually are very personal. They're about my family. Mm-hmm. So the backstory here is that my mother, she was a member of the Federal Parliament for about 20 years in the Senate representing Tasmania. And she was also a minister in the Howard government. What I didn't know was that in the 1990s, when the Howard government sought to overturn and did successfully overturn the Northern Territory voluntary assisted dying legislation, my mother actually voted against her own government. That was a conscience vote thing at the time, but she voted against it unsuccessfully. And she gave a speech in the Senate, which I used extracts of when I gave my evidence to the Queensland Parliamentary Inquiry. So I didn't know about that. What I did know, but probably didn't know enough about, was the way that my mum had researched the whole issue of voluntary assisted dying, had done a lot of work herself to understand it. And the final piece of the puzzle was that she then ended up with Alzheimer's. And for 5 years, the poor woman was in high care at a nursing home on the south coast of New South Wales. And for 2 of her final years, she was actually in a bed basically, and she just couldn't interact with people at all. The bottom line is, my mother was a firm supporter of voluntary assisted dying, and if she had known how she'd ended up, she would have been appalled. She'd have been angry with myself and my sister. I mean, I'm sort of joking about it, but she would have been really, really annoyed because she didn't want to die in that way. So those elements, and they're all personal elements, came together for me a few years ago, and I said, well, look, this is crazy. And I started to think long and hard about it myself, and I came to the view that I have today, which I think with appropriate safeguards, is something that we should support.
So it doesn't conflict your Church of England. How religious are you, and does it conflict with those religious beliefs? And if so, why not?
Okay, well, look, I'm not a church goer, but I actually am religious. And in this household, for example, a bit old-fashioned, but we say prayers every night. And sadly, we've had some people who are dear to us pass away in recent times, and we've also got a number of people who are struggling with health issues. So yeah, we are religious. We pray every night, and I guess I think I weigh it up against where we've come in terms of medical science. Once upon a time, people that we keep alive today through the advances in medical technology, they would have died well before the state that they're in. And look, this is about people's choice. It's not about compulsion. If adults who are sound of mind, who have looked into it, who've been through a process that the legislation would take account of and prescribe, then at the end of the day, it's their right, it's their life. But just to finish off the religious thing, my mother was deeply religious. She was a church goer. She prayed herself, and also she when after she died, when my sister was going through her personal effects, we found all sorts of little things that just indicated the deepness of that religious faith. I mean, she had a Bible. She actually read it. There were letters where she, from the time when she was in her early 20s, that we saw in her effects, where she was literally examining her own religious faith. So she was able to reconcile her support for VAD with her religious faith as well. And I have no problem with it as well, because at the end of the day, I don't believe that our Maker would want us to suffer, and I don't believe our Maker would has a problem if their if they're a generous and benevolent God would have a problem with us choosing to not go through a terrible, painful existence, or an existence without dignity.
The other thing is both sides have what they call extreme views. The Catholic bishops are obviously never ever going to be for, because they have all life is sacred, and then you have people that could possibly have their own intentions for it, which is that inheritance impatience, or the elderly feeling that they're a burden on the family or on society, and therefore they feel that they have to volunteer for this assisted dying. How would you think you come to terms with those statements?
Well, I think perhaps I'll deal with the latter part first. In terms of the concerns that you just raised then, that has to be dealt with by good, sound process. And there are many ways you can do this, and checks and balances you can put in place to ensure that someone isn't being pressured or whatever. But again, it comes down to someone's personal choice. They have to be sound of mind, they have to have thought through the whole thing, they have to take advice from professional people, and that all has to be, I believe, documented. And I'm not into bureaucracy or red tape, but on this, it's so critically important. Obviously, it's got to be done right. But at the end of the day, again, it comes back to choice, and a process that ensures there's no sort of feeling of compulsion or something like that going on. In terms of the sanctity of life thing and the Catholic Church, well, here's where I differentiate a bit in terms of my treatment of various issues. I have a real problem with the legislation that was passed in Queensland in terms of what I'd call significant late-term abortion. And the reason is that there is a human being that has no choice, has no say in the matter, that's being terminated, for maybe some important and legitimate circumstance, but it's no choice. There's no choice for them. No one's consulting them, and it could be for convenience. So I have a real problem. I don't have a problem with very early abortions, but what happened in Queensland in the Parliament in the last few years on that matter is a travesty. This is different. This is about adults who are of sound mind, again, as I've said a few times already, making their own decision after going through a process.
Good. Do you think the delay in passing these laws, which they've had a year to consider, so they're not going to be tabled, I think, if that's the right word, until October, till after the election, do you think it's politically motivated that they've been delayed?
Oh, absolutely, and it's really sad. It's and I hesitate a bit about sounding too political when discussing a topic like this, but the actions that have been taken by the Premier are political. It's all too hard, and she doesn't wish to deal with it prior to the election, and that's a great pity. But if I look at the other side of the House, the LNP need to be very clear about how they're going to deal with it, and I think the LNP should be prepared to encourage the Premier to bring it on through a conscience vote. Now, I'm not saying the LNP have to support it. I mean, again, every person should be entitled to a conscience vote, but surely the LNP can say, look, this should be dealt with as an important social issue, because every day we don't deal with it is a day that people are put in terrible situations, in pain, in situations like my own mother living without dignity in a terrible existence, and it's incumbent on us to at least try and find a way forward on this whole vexed issue.
I think that's it. Unless there's anything else you'd like to add further to it.
No, I think that's pretty much it. I just hope it gets dealt with, and the good thing about this debate, I believe, is that while it is quite emotionally charged, unlike other political issues of today, it's actually, if you reflect for a moment, it's actually been dealt with in a quite respectful manner, I believe. Yes, people make, sort of tough statements, maybe even a bit out there statements in terms of their particular point of view, but there hasn't been quite the, well, there hasn't been, sorry, I should start again, there hasn't been the quite inflamed rhetoric that you've seen around other issues. Say, for example, gay marriage. You know, that was an emotion-charged issue. This has been handled to date in Queensland in a respectful and sober way by everybody, I would say.